Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our storage design and modeling meeting. Today, my name is Brenda Corona Marquez. On behalf of the Stakeholder Affairs Group, we welcome you today, who those are on site, as well for those who are joining us virtually. I'll go ahead and go over some few housekeeping reminders for both in-person and virtual. Sergio, if you can move this slide. On the first, we do want to let you know that this call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. It will be available on the CAISO website. So, so any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. This meeting is structured to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives. And as your facilitator, I will help guide any comments and questions for a productive flow. So we encourage comments to be a little bit on the shorter side, and then also avoid revisiting points that have been recovered to allow space for other voices. Closed captioning is available, as well as the transparency bureau that will be popping up on the bottom of the WebEx screen. And then we can go ahead and further questions. We all encourage on both people who are on site and virtual, please state your full name and affiliation before stating a comment. Those who are on the WebEx, you will see you'll hear your unmute button, but make sure you wait about 2 seconds before speaking so we can capture your introduction. If you are just dialed in through audio only, we will use the call me option. And if you're also connected by the phone line, we'll do the *3. You could also send questions through chat, but I definitely encourage more of the questions to be asked verbally. We definitely want to capture those in the recording. If you do experience any technical issues, Ryan is our event producer for today and will help us with any other items. And then we go next slide. This is an overview for the CAISO initiative stakeholder process. Both Ali Mays and a few of her team members have kind of provided this diagram. We are kind of collaborating and working on providing an overview of where we're at. As we have posted on the 15th, our paper, we're working towards other next steps we will be sharing in this meeting as well. Go ahead, next slide. I'll go ahead and just do a quick overview on the agenda, and then I will introduce Sergio and the team to kind of go over in kind of high level what we're going to cover. Basically, for today, we'll kind of have a meeting goals and initiative overview, followed by a straw proposal on the storage default energy bid enhancements, and also a straw proposal for the hybrid default energy bid. We plan to do an open discussion as well, but keep in mind, we do want to stay in schedule from 1 to 2 within the same topic. So if you do have any additional questions, please let us know so we can follow up during the open discussion queue. We aiming for a break around 2:50, but if that doesn't happen, we'll let you know, so that way we can continue the productive flow, and then we'll end with the discussion of NGR bidding concepts. And then also, we did post our slides as well a few days ago, and then also the comment template that is available. We will cover those deadlines later on, but other than that, I'll pass it to Sergio and the team who will be kicking us off, and then Dinesh will be joining us around 2 p.m. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Brenda. And yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sergio Dueñas. It's nice to be here in the room with some of you and digitally with others. Looking forward for the conversation today. I think perhaps before we go on, it would be valuable to promote some of my colleagues here as panelists. So if we could promote Dinesh Dasgupta, that would be great. And let's see. Yeah, I think that's all for now. Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's get started. So first, I wanted to kind of set the tone a little bit, the stage for what we want to accomplish today, and remind folks what we're driving towards, at least in the near term. The goal today really is to go over, discuss, foment some additional conversation and back and forth on what was included in the paper we published the 15th. So we'll go over our the approaches detailed in the straw proposal to enhance the storage default energy bid, I'll pass it on to Dinesh to discuss the straw proposal to develop a default energy bid for hybrid resources. And then we want to use the last part of the call really to discuss and explore some key questions with stakeholders around this concept of NGR bidding being reframed. I think a lot of the comments we got from the prior conversation were like, this is interesting, there's more questions, it would be valuable for us to discuss it further. So we've reserved some time and we've included some discussion questions to try to guide the conversation today, but also to inform perhaps some of your comments in the written comments coming up later on. So all of this, just as we articulated in the paper, really the goal is that we can move forward with more clarity on where we are driving towards on storage default energy bids and storage modeling and bidding, so that that can inform our discussions around uplift as well this year, and we can drive towards a draft final proposal on those topics this year. This is a very similar timeline to what we shared in our last meeting. Really, there's only a couple of dates that have shifted from the fact that our paper, also the publication, was shifted for a couple weeks. But I think this really kind of highlights the idea that we want to move forward on the conversations around default energy bids and state of charge management bidding, so that those can inform the discussions on redesign uplift paradigm for storage, and that we can produce a draft final proposal right in time for Halloween, ideally. That is definitely part of the goal. So with that, that's kind of setting the stage a bit to what we'll discuss today. I'll pause briefly here to see if there's any questions, comments, and if not, we can go right into kind of the material that we prepared today to help everyone digest a bit the paper and ideally facilitate some engaging discussion on it. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands in the room. Let me check online. Nope, perfect. Okay, excellent. Well, let's get started then and go right into the subject matter for today. So in the paper, we detailed two approaches to enhance the storage default energy bid, the time of day approach and the static approach. Through the slides that I'll present next, I'll first do a very quick kind of overview of the DEB today to make sure that we're all on the same page. I know that for many stakeholders, this will be very familiar and they know it by heart by now, but I think it's good to set the stage for everyone. And then I'll kind of discuss these two approaches that are detailed in the paper and why currently we see the time of day approach as perhaps our preferred alternative for further development. But we really want to hear from you all today and in your written comments if there are elements of the time of day approach that could be enhanced or modified, if there are elements of the static approach that could be better included in the time of day approach, or if you support one of the other approaches, right, the static over time of day. So we want to facilitate that conversation today. So let's start by setting the current status quo context for everyone. So today we have a default energy bid for storage resources that follows the formula I'm showing here. As you can tell, it's really looking at four cost components, four cost variables: the energy cost, the price-based opportunity cost, and the variable storage operations cost. In today's storage DEB, the first cost component that I mentioned was the energy cost, and it's trying to estimate the average cost of the energy that is charging the storage resource. This, similarly to the price-based opportunity cost, is derived by looking at cost proxies that are sourced from prior market runs relative to the market run in which the default energy bid would be used. So for example, in the day-ahead default energy bid, we are sourcing the estimates for the energy cost from the day-ahead local NPM run. And in real time, we're sourcing that from the day-ahead run. The price-based opportunity cost, it's kind of the other side of this calculation that is really looking at what is the opportunity cost when to determine when that discharged energy would be sold at different hours during the day. So we are really trying to capture what's the value of the stored energy, because that's a very important component on the bids of resources, right? Today, a resource may want to bid at a high value to discharge to convey that they have an economic unwillingness to be discharged at that interval. And that value in their bid is seeking to represent their opportunity cost, their ability to perhaps then discharge that energy at a future price that is higher. So the price-based opportunity cost is also an estimation that, similar to the energy cost, is basically based on cost proxies that are sourced from prior market runs relative to when we actually use the default energy bid. So these two components of the current storage tab, default energy bid, already are, let's say, exposed or subject to the challenge of being based on values that are stale or outdated by the moment that they're being leveraged in the DEB. And the third component, the variable storage operations cost, is really trying to represent the cycling and other variable operational costs of storage. Today, like as of this moment, if a scheduling coordinator wants to have a non-zero value, they can submit a ticket to do that, but the default value would be a zero value. I do want to stress that the ISO is in the process of modifying this so that there might be a default value that is non-zero, and it's actually based on the historical submissions of other resources. This is key because for many resources, a non-zero default value is, well, definitely closer to their operational reality, but also it could be leveraged and utilized as part of the future dev approaches, as we'll discuss. So the final element that I want to stress about the current storage default energy bid is that because it leverages outputs from prior market runs, the resources that participate only in the WEIM and are not participating in EDAM, basically resources in the regional footprint that are only real-time assets, those resources, it cannot readily leverage the storage default energy bid calculation. So this creates a complication for them, right? They need instead to pursue a negotiated default energy bid, which creates administrative burden on them and basically every entity that is involved in that process. So with all of this in mind, and through the several conversations we've had on this in the past, we reached this problem statement that I'm trying to summarize here, but it's explained in a bit more detail in the paper. That effectively the storage default energy bid's dependence on outputs from prior market runs creates a couple of challenges. First, it creates the stale value challenge, that we are using cost proxies that may not be the most updated. And second, it creates the challenge that resources that are not part of the extended day-ahead market may not readily be able to leverage this calculation. And the other problem that we identified along with stakeholders through this process is that today, the default energy bid for storage results in a static value, and that may over or underestimate the opportunity costs of these resources, particularly in real time. So with that in mind, really the goal that we have with this piece is we want to have a storage default energy bid that is designed in a way that can reflect changing real-time opportunity costs, that can ensure the correct placement of storage within the bid stack, even under mitigation, meaning that storage should be, even if mitigated, placed similarly to other energy or use limited resources. We also want the default energy bid for storage to be calculated in a way that any resource, regardless of location, can readily leverage that option rather than having to go pursue a negotiated option. And finally, we want it to be designed in a way that minimizes the risks of charging side mitigation. And we have an example later in this presentation that explains why charging side mitigation could prove problematic or difficult in the current with the current default energy bid, and how the two approaches detailed in the paper could help address that. Okay. So we took all of this. This is what I just discussed, was also discussed in May. It really was a part of a level setting conversation. And in the May meeting, we presented a draft straw proposal on how we thought we could reform or enhance the storage default energy bid. And we got a lot of very valuable feedback from you all. And I think the paper does a very concise and clear job at detailing what stakeholder argued what and what was the rationale, and we tried to respond to that. Here, I'm really summarizing from the 10,000 feet view, right? So in general, I think there's a very significant share of stakeholders that support addressing the stale value issue. That is the challenge that the current storage tab is leveraging cost proxies that come from prior market runs. We also saw significant support for including the gas floor within the storage default energy bid. This was recommended by stakeholders that noted that this could increase alignment between the hydro and the storage tab. And it was also supported by this notion of, well, to the degree that we can make this hydro and storage default energy bids generally similar, we will ensure that even if those assets are mitigated, they're treated somewhat similarly and positioned somewhat similarly within the bid stack. We also saw significant opposition to the idea of having this time of day multipliers, or basically multipliers that modify the real-time default energy bid, be lower than 1. This was a very interesting area of discussion, because I think while some stakeholders noted that, theoretically it is possible that your opportunity costs are lower at different parts of the day, a lot of the argument around this hinged on whether it would be reasonable for your real-time default energy bid to be lower than your day-ahead default energy bid, for example. And finally, I think the final group that I really want to underscore on the feedback we got is we did see a subset of commenters, several commenters, that cautioned against the complexity of the time of day approach as we discussed it in May, and that recommended instead that we pursue something a bit simpler, something a bit more static, that is almost or very much identical to the hydro default energy bid. So it is this last part of the discussion that really pushed us to consider, let's offer the two approaches, let's compare them in the paper, let's articulate why we believe the time of day approach may be better suited to address some of our challenges, but let's also get feedback from stakeholders as to if elements of the static approach are worthwhile further discussion or incorporation into other methods. So with that, I will now go into each of the two approaches. I'll kind of explore the time of day approach, and then I'll explore the static one, and we'll go through some comparisons. Um, I will pause after each of the approaches to see if there's any questions or reactions of the approach itself. But I think the majority of the discussion might be more on the comparison of them. So in the straw proposal, we include these two approaches. Um, Here, I'm trying to, with this table, I'm trying to summarize kind of how these two approaches address the problem statement and guiding principles that I just presented. I do want to note that, when you look at this table right away, it does seem like, well, the time of day approach is perhaps more aligned with these goals but I also want to underscore that, some of the changes in the static approach are really by design. Like it is trying to be by design, um, more a less complex version, let's say, that is more than trying to address the specific issues or guiding principles. It's really trying to be very much aligned with the HydroDev. So some of the no's in this table, they're not really to underscore any deficiency of the static approach. They're more so to underscore how that design decision impacts that role. So, okay, first is really this element of the stale value issue. In the time of day framework, we have a step that would include an upward scaling, if needed, of the cost proxies leveraged in the default energy bid. In the static approach, there would be no such scaling process. Um, the argument really is in the time of day approach, we want that scaling process because it's similar to what some negotiated devs have out there. Um, it's something that is doable and that can update those stale values given recent conditions. The trade-off, though, or why the static approach would not want to include the scaling process is that such a process is not included in the HydroDev. So including it as part of the static approach would create those kind of differences already. On the second one is really around the regional applicability of the default energy bid. We see that both of these approaches create a methodology that can be readily leveraged by any storage resource. The only difference, the only asterisk there is really that the time of day approach does it with a difference in the cost proxy leverage for those within EDAM and those in WEIM only. This is important, and this is definitely an area where we've seen feedback from stakeholders kind of both ways. So we definitely welcome discussion on this point because this is an area where, perhaps the static and time of day approaches could be more similar, or that difference is valuable. So we continue to welcome feedback on that point. I think really the next two are pretty much interrelated. They're really all about reflecting changing opportunity costs, particularly in real time, and making sure that storage resources, when they're mitigated, they're positioned similarly to other energy or use limited assets. We see the time of day approach as really meeting both of those goals. In the case of the static approach, it is really by design that it is not seeking to reflect on a day-to-day basis changing opportunity costs in real time, so as to be a less complex approach, let's say. But because of that decision as well, it could hinder a bit the ability of that approach to ensure the correct placement of storage in the bid stack under mitigation, right? Because one could imagine that the resource maybe experiences a lower opportunity cost in the latter hours of the day, then it's subject to mitigation, but under the static approach, that change would not be recognized in the value. And then finally, as we'll go through this, both of these approaches are really designed to minimize the risk of charging side mitigation. We've seen why this is a concern, why this could happen, how this could happen in the status quo. So we've really tried to make sure that either of these approaches can eliminate that risk in a consistent manner. Okay. So, what is really the time of day approach, and what changes have we made since we last discussed this in May? So the key goal of the time of day approach is to incorporate some elements from the hydro default energy bid, and to create a framework that allows for storage default energy bid that minimizes the risks of stale values, stale cost proxies, and that better represents changing opportunity costs in real time. So we are in this with this framework, with this approach. What we're trying to do is first, we are removing energy costs from the calculation, from the DEB calculation. We are adding the gas floor, and that is very much in line with this idea of aligning with the hydro default energy bid, and making sure that they're placed in the correct position in the bid stack, even if mitigated. We are also creating a step that would introduce scaling for the price proxies to better reflect, expected conditions. This step is looking at the last 3 days, and if the last 3 days, let's say in real time, if we take a look at the last 3 days and day ahead prices are generally lower than real time prices over the last 3 days by X percentage, we would scale that. That way, this is a very set and forget approach. It's automated. It's looking immediately at the prior days, and it's an upward only scaling. This is pretty critical because if we were to look back and see that real-time prices are actually a bit lower than they had prices consistently, we wouldn't deflate that cost proxy, therefore impacting lowering the DEB. This is only an upward adjustment. And then the final piece that I include here is that we would include as well this multiplier that is different within the max formulation, and that in real time, in addition, we will add a time of day multiplier. So the idea is the multipliers within the calculation are all aligned with the hydro DEB, and in real time, we have an additional multiplier that is setting or capturing those changing opportunity costs in real time. Based on stakeholder feedback, that time of day multiplier would never be lower than 1, right? So that way, would never have this a circumstance where you end up like with a lower real time DEB. This is also important because it keeps, that delta of changing opportunity costs, but it doesn't make it so that the default energy bid is, lowered relative to the cost proxies just by the multiplier. How does this look mathematically? For those that are mathematically inclined, you can look at it here. I think the interesting part of this, if I can like put your attention here, is like, if you look at the first 2 rows, the first 2 rows are the day ahead DEB. This is basically very, very similar to the hydro default energy bid. And the charge DEB is defined as the discharge minus the variable operations cost. So that way we will always have a delta. We will always have a difference between the discharge and charge. And then in real time, we're basically doing the same as in day ahead, but with the addition of this time of day multiplier. I will stop there because I see a question in the room, and I will encourage folks on the phone, if you have any questions at this point, if you want to raise your hand as well.
Go ahead, Don.
Don Trethewey, California Energy Storage Alliance. Can we go back one slide, Sergio? I was going to more make a comment. First of all, I think this is the most progress we've made on improving the DEB in this revised proposal that we have through the entire process. So we've made some, I think, some significant enhancements here. And the one comment that I wanted to make is, you know, on the scaling of the prior proxies, I think what we've done here is we've recognized that if there's a systemic difference between, you know, if the real-time prices are for the past 3 days are systemically higher than day-ahead prices, we want to, you know, have that reflected in the real-time DEBs, which I think is a good idea. I think one thing that we'd always highlighted, that if there was like a material change between what was considered day-ahead, like something completely changed between day-ahead and real-time, do you want to have like a one-time reset where you update the DEBs for everybody? And so I think I just wanted to point out that I think it's two separate issues. I agree with doing something to recognize if systemically the real-time price is higher than day-ahead prices, we need to make that adjustment. But there still may be the need to do something if there's material changes, but I just wanted to make sure that we had those separate.
Yes, thank you, Don. Appreciate the comment on the progress being made, and I also appreciate the kind of comment on whether do we need this like kind of baked into the methodology as opposed to, let's say, having it as a lever we can use in operations in some days, perhaps. I think what we've identified internally at this point is that a process to update the DEB, even if we were to, you know the multiplier ahead of time and like deploy it as needed if conditions were very different, it is quite complex. Not to say that it is something insurmountable, but it is perhaps more complex than what we do today, that is calculate the DEBs at one point and then, it's kind of like you get the output and that goes into the systems it has to. But that is something that we can explore and also detail more the kind of trade-offs or complexities of it in future discussions. So I appreciate that.
And I would note, I think that what it actually does highlight those, one of the things we've also highlighted that we think is important is to sort of publish the system-wide SOC relative to what the day-ahead optimal SOC was, and to get that information out to participants. So maybe it doesn't reflect the DEB, but it allows people to reflect their energy bids, that the whole system's SOC is, for instance, short, which means there's a higher probability in the peak hours that everyone might not be charged up.
Yeah, I think that the publishing of that information is something we're very interested in and looking into it to basically ease or kind of allow market participants to inform their bidding. So I agree with that spirit. Yeah.
Okay, Sergio. We do have one question in the room and also another.
Okay.
Carrie, go ahead.
This is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. Just following up on that, are the multipliers going to be configurable, or are they going to be baked into the tariff?
So that is a good question. I went back to this slide because you can see the multipliers here. The multipliers that we're including here are basically the same multipliers that are in the hydro DEB. And a lot of that was because it's twofold, really. The first one is folks that have urged us to align this with the hydro DEB have made great points of we would want to treat energy or use limited resources consistently. So the fact that these DEBs look similar is important. The second point is that in particular, the 1.4 value was pretty much related to this notion of minimizing the use of 4-hour assets over frequency of time, let's say. Maybe I'm not wording it perfectly, but yeah, the idea would be that these values would be detailed in the BPM very clearly so that they're basically the same as the hydro DEB to ensure that consistency. That being said, if folks believe that like exact alignment with the HydroDev is a lower goal to pursue than redoing an analysis to inform those values. We look forward to your comments, but I think in this, what we've heard from a lot of stakeholders is let's move quicker on this. Let's make design decisions that are consistent with what we have. And yeah, hopefully that helps, Carrie.
Yeah, maybe just to clarify, so WPTF agrees with, I guess, CISA and Dawn, that this is a great step forward and that this is a good place to start. I more meant, is that 1.4, like for hydro, I'm pretty sure it's baked into the system. Like there's no way to go in and easily change that. However, you could make it configurable, i.e., yes, it's just in the BPM, and if you find something wrong with it, then you could update it quickly. And so I'm asking whether you would consider making it within the implementation configurable, so that it's not baked into the tariff and it could be updated easily if we find out maybe that 1.4 is not the exact one, or if, as Dawn says, something happens systematically and there's a bigger difference between day ahead and real time. And then that's the multiplier I'm thinking of the most that we might want to play with.
So the scaling multiplier is not shown here in this formula. No, the scaling step is we're not limiting it to like 1.4 or something like that. The scaling step is looking at, let me put the example of real time. The hour that is setting the price-based opportunity cost is hour ending 19. Let's look at the prices for hour ending 19 in the last 3 days between real time and day ahead. Oh, the real time price was 5% higher than day ahead for that hour. Scale it by 5%. That is independent of the proxy of the formula I use here. So the element that reads PBOC in the top row, that includes the scaling already. Then on top of that, we do the 1.4. Then we pick the max of any of those. Does that kind of help too? Okay. And thank you for the feedback
Sir-
on making it configurable. That's really helpful.
Yes, Sergio, this is Don. Can I just add? I think the key is for hydro, that 1.4 was determined empirically. And I think the argument that you're making is that for a 4-hour battery, empirically, we'd probably get to the same 1.4 value as we did for hydro, because we said we only wanted to dispatch hydro a maximum of 4 hours. But the key is it can be empirically determined. And I think I agree with Carrie. That's why having these configurable, because if you do see through empirical evidence that you need to make an adjustment, it would be far more efficient for us to make a BPM change, use that empirical data as the BPM change, than to have to do a tariff filing.
We do have Jay Rumble. Let's make sure we capture his quick question.
Hi, this is John Rumble, Southern California Edison. Really like what we're talking about here. Edison is very supportive of moving forward expeditiously. We really believe that these storage devs need to be based on really transparent, ISO market outcomes, and certainly not external power hub indices, which are just very can be very illiquid and really can be subject to manipulation. So we're very supportive of moving in this direction. One thing to think about is today we've got, I don't know, 24,000 megawatts of 4-hour batteries. That may not be the case. Especially the IRP seems to be moving towards the California CPUC IRP seems to be moving towards a place where longer duration batteries are probably going to be better incentivized to coming out of the system. So we may just want to keep in the back of our heads, make sure that we're not setting up a framework for only one type of sort of storage resource, if you know what I'm saying. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Next, we do have Paul. Go ahead. Please be brief if you may. Paul, we can't hear you still. We'll come back to Paul. Let's go ahead and do Carl, and then I think that's all we have time for.
Hi, this is Carl from the Public Advocate's Office. I wanted to say two quick things, though I do think Paul's point was important, so I do hope we can bring him back in. The first was to agree with Don here that I was surprised that the definition of stale didn't incorporate any data that was revealed on the real-time trade date. I would have thought that sort of a crucial part of not being stale is to incorporate things that you learn on the day. So perhaps that's impossible, but it does seem like we're still using stale data in that definition. The other point I wanted to make was maybe a little nuanced about the TOD multiplier here. I'm concerned about the timing of it. So my understanding is for a 4-hour battery that it would be based on the fourth highest price of the calculated scaled price series. But that fourth highest value could occur at very different points in the day. So if it happens after the evening peak or shortly before the evening peak or even during the morning peak, you would have quite different DEB outcomes. So 2 points I wanted to raise there. Feel free to address them. But I, again, think it would be great to have Paul's voice in here as well.
Yeah, just to quickly address your points, Carl. Yeah, the current proposal as described in the paper would be to have that change in the hour that set the price-based opportunity cost. It could also be, for example, in the peak hour of the day. And I think that something that we can think about working on for the next iteration is kind of showing the frequency, or like what hour would that be in across months, seasons, etc. And we can provide some of that information. On your point about the stale values, yeah, I mean, leveraging information from real time the day of is quite complex. We go into detail in the paper we produced in December around why that is pretty difficult. So here, what we're trying to do is we're trying to mitigate the staleness, perhaps, but not by fully eliminating it. We're mitigating it by having that scaling step in the time of day approach. I do want to underscore once more that in the static one, there wouldn't be any scaling. Thank you for the comments. I think we have Paul again.
Let's go ahead, Paul.
Yes, Paul Warhatch, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, Paul Warhatch from the Public Advocate's Office at CPC. Thanks for, within the problem statement, I think, Sergio, you appropriately included both overestimation and underestimation of opportunity costs as the motivation for moving towards a dynamic DEB. And our concern is that this only will serve to further overvalue the opportunity costs in those hours that are potentially most critical, and hours in which the potential to exercise market power is most severe. That could result in resources that are attempting to exercise market power, setting the market price. So I think that's our general concern with this floor of 1.0 that may be appropriate, let's say, in hours preceding those critical hours, but extending to the critical hours makes it problematic. We also, I generally agree that there's value and consistency for a default energy bid across different sorts of storage resources, energy limited resources. But given that storage, battery-based storage, 4-hour storage, and as John said, increasingly perhaps longer durations will be the dominant resources, that it's important to have that empirical basis based on the resource, and then apply it, apply the appropriate value to hydro that's determined for storage. So thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I mean, I would just say on the first point you raised, we're definitely trying to execute a balancing act on the under and overestimation of opportunity cost, right? It is also important for us that the DEB is sufficiently high in the hours preceding when we expect to utilize the resource so that the resource can convey its economic willingness and not be perhaps subject to incremental dispatch from mitigation that then risks the ability of that resource to provide energy when it's the most needed. So I definitely think it's a balancing act between making it high enough when bids are needed to manage state of charge and making it also accurate enough when the peak hours maybe have passed. But we definitely welcome feedback on how we could perhaps tweak that multiplier definition or its values to better address that. Let's go with Dawn, and after that, I'll keep going for the next
Yeah.
section.
So Don Trethway with CISA, I just wanted to address the concern that the storage resource would try to exert market power during the peak critical hours. Assuming that we didn't have, a significant change in system conditions between day ahead and real time, the storage resource is going to be scheduled in day ahead to discharge energy during those hours. So in essence, they would harm themselves by having to buy back at a higher price than their day ahead schedules. So I think the real issue is the hours preceding those, as you pointed out. And then I think the question there is one that we can answer empirically. I was going to wait to make this comment till we got to that section, but I think you're saying for only the 1 hour preceding, would you put the 1.4? I think we can empirically determine whether it should be 1 hour, 2 hour, based upon, if we used 1 hour, how often do we miss the peak? Assume storage is all storage is bidding at their depths. We do it 1 hour. Do we miss the peak? Do we do it 2 hours? And I think, again, I think that's something we can answer empirically. And I think that's what should mitigate the concerns that the gentleman from the CPUC highlighted. If you use the time of day multiplier, you only want to use it in the hours where it ensures that you don't dispatch and dispatch the storage before you actually get to the actual real-time peak. And so we should be able to limit it to those hours. Limit it to the duration that you need to make sure empirically that doesn't occur.
Thank you, Don. Very, very useful feedback right there. And I definitely exhort you all to please include that in your written comments too, so that it can help us formulate the revision or next version of this. So I'm going to go through the next part that is basically the static approach and the comparison. And then I'll pause again to see if there's any reactions, questions, feedback. But really what I want to underscore here is, the static approach is, you can imagine it either as a modified version of the hydro default energy bid or as a modified version of the time of day approach that I just discussed. Really the whole goal of the static approach is to have a storage default energy bid that is fairly similar to the hydro one. It promotes this consistency across energy reuse limited resources. And it is quite important here that it's leveraging the same price proxy for all resources. So in the time of day approach, if you were an EDAM resource, we're looking at LMPs. If you're a WEIM only resource, we're looking at the price in a hub. Here, for everyone, we're looking at the price in the hub. So in the static approach, as I mentioned, the short-term component is based on that day-ahead power price index from the local default electric pricing hub. This is by design so that it's consistent with the hydro methodology. And just like in the time of day approach, the charge default energy bid is equal to the discharge default energy bid minus the variable operating cost. Again, very important, as we'll see in a couple of slides. So what are really the key differences between the time of day and the static approach? I would say it's two. That the static approach uses the same local hub price proxy for everyone. And the second one is that the static approach does not include any stale value scaling or any time of day multiplier. It is, as the name says, static. So this is a formulation. If you were to go to our BPMs and look at the hydro default energy bid, you would see something very similar. The key differences relative to the hydro default energy bid is there's no long-term component. And we are adding the variable opportunity cost here as an addition rather than as another option to the maximizing function. This will be very clear in the examples that we put together, the effect of this. So how do these approaches compare? So here I have an example. This is the example we included in the paper. In the paper, we detail all of the assumptions around it, and you can fairly easily replicate it at home if you're interested. Here, I'm trying to show the status quo, the time of day, and the static approaches using the same inputs. There are only two things, two key assumptions that are important to note here, but I'll note them in time. So first, look at the status quo. The status quo today would result in a discharge and charge deb that are the same value. This can create complication. Keep that in mind. Under the time of day and the static approaches, under both of them, we have always a difference between the charge and the discharge deb. That difference is always equal to the variable operating costs of the asset. Then the differences in values between the time of day and the static approach in this slide for the day ahead values can really be attributed to two sources. The first one is that, as I mentioned before, the static approach adds the variable operations cost to the deb. So it does like a maximizing function of looking at the gas floor, looking at the opportunity cost component, and then adding the variable operating cost. The time of day considers the variable opportunity cost as another option in the maximizing function. So that's why the static is a bit higher. The other important assumption with this is that the time of day bars here are assuming no scaling. We wanted to give you an example without any need for stale value scaling, because this basically means this would be the floor of the deb under these assumptions, right? It could only be higher if there was scaling involved, but this example doesn't include scaling. But you can see that basically in terms of day ahead, they're in the same ballpark, the day ahead and static approaches. Their only differences are by how they consider the variable opportunity costs. Now, this is the comparison in real time, and this is where it gets more interesting. So first, you can see at the bottom of this graph, you can see that blue line that is solid and that dotted like cyan line. Those are the current values. Those are the status quo values. And again, they show that today we would get the same charge and discharge deb in real time. Then in pink or purple, we have the static approach. Again, the dashed line represents the charge deb, which is always lower than the discharge deb. And the time of day one also has that gap, that spread between the charge and discharge. But in addition, it has that change at hour ending 19, right? It lowers at hour ending 19 because of the changing opportunity costs. The whole premise of the time of day relative to the status quo is that yes, it would result on a higher deb in this circumstance because of the multipliers, but it will also result in a higher deb earlier in the day so as to enable that ability to use bidding to manage your state of charge. The static approach does something similar, but again, it remains static through the day. And this last example or graph I want to walk you through shows the value of having differing charge and discharge debs across the board. So we can imagine an asset submitting a bid curve like the one in gray here. If this asset submitted a bid curve like the one in gray here, and it was subject to being mitigated under the debts that we calculated in the prior example, it would have all of its discharge segments, everything right of the y-axis, and several of its charge segments mitigated to the same value today. This can create a lot of complication, right? Because from the market's perspective now, the asset is basically indifferent at being dispatched along this range at that price. We know that is not true, right? Because the assets always have degradation costs, so they always have operational costs. So the goal of the modification for the charge and discharge debt, as we've explained it, is that we will always preserve at least that variable operating cost difference. So that way the market can recognize what is actually that difference necessary, even if some part of the charging range is mitigated to preserve monotonicity. Okay, so really the last point I'll cover, and then we'll go to any questions or feedback, is that, at this time, we do believe that there is value in further developing the time of day approach. It best addresses the challenges we've seen and we've documented through this process. And while it is a bit more complex than the static approach, we believe that its complexity can be minimized in implementation. And we also ask in this process to stakeholders, we still want to hear obviously your feedback. Any feedback on the static approach or its elements will continue to be considered to inform our proposal. So we want to hear from you. Are there elements of the static approach that should be considered in the time of day approach? Are there elements in the time of day approach that maybe warrant revision or modification? And with that, I'll pause here. I know we wanted to end this at 2, but obviously it's fine if we go a little bit over. It'll probably just eat into the break, but yeah, I'll stop here.
All right, Sergio. Yeah, so these are great questions. And also just a reminder, we do have that comment template. That would also be a great opportunity to kind of go over those questions and add it there. But going with the room first, if there's any questions, let me know. Seeing none, let's go to WebEx. I'll let maybe 5 seconds for those who are trying to raise their hand using the raise hand icon located in the middle of your screen, or *3 if you're just dialed in through phone line. I see none. Go ahead, Sergio. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for letting us close on time. This topic, I appreciate that. So I think the next piece we had is around the hybrid default energy bids. And my colleague Dinesh will join us for it. Yeah, if we can promote him, I see it as an attendee.
Yeah, let's go ahead and add him. And a quick audio and video check. Dinesh. Dinesh, we can't hear you still, so just want to give you a heads up. Now we see you. Go ahead, do audio, quick check. Nope, we can't hear you yet.
Maybe in the meantime, while Dinesh gets his audio, if we couldn't make him co-host and presenter so he could move the slides, that would be great as well. Thank you.
So Dinesh, click take control if you like, but we can still not hear you. Dinesh, we cannot hear you, just letting you know, still. Let me send you the phone line so you can just dial it in.
Is this line any better?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Okay, good. Good to know. Cool. Well, thank you very much for your patience, everyone. We'll get moving into the straw proposal on hybrid default energy bids now. And so just to start off with, a little summary of where we're at in the process. So we've heard from stakeholders that there is strong support for development of a dedicated hybrid default energy bid methodology. And this was discussed during scoping. This was also something that Wellhead provided a proposal on in September 2025. And between the proposal and the comments and what have you, stakeholders generally agreed that hybrid default energy bids should reflect the characteristics of the underlying components. So if, let's say, there was a hybrid resource with a solar component and a battery component, that hybrid default energy bid should in some way reflect the characteristics of both that solar component and the storage component. In the September 2025 stakeholder meeting, Wellhead proposed setting the hybrid default energy bid as the greater of the default energy bids applicable to the hybrid resources underlying components. So in that same example of a solar and a storage unit, solar and storage components making up a hybrid unit, if the storage unit has the storage depth is higher than the LMP option, which is representing the solar component, then the storage depth should be the applicable default energy bid for the entire hybrid resource. In response to that meeting, multiple stakeholders supported Wellhead's proposal as a practical and straightforward near-term solution that the ISO should pursue. So going into a little bit more detail on this greater approach, the ISO considered Wellhead's proposal here and provided that top bullet summary of a rewrite of kind of what the proposal was. The ISO also believed that for this approach to be viable, a minimum share requirement would be needed. What does this mean? So essentially, the idea is that a component must be at least a certain percentage of the total resource capacity for it to be considered as something that could be in the greater of calculation. So for example, if there was a 100 megawatt hybrid resource made up of a 99 megawatt solar component and a 1 megawatt battery storage component, the ISO does not believe that it would be appropriate to use the storage depth in this circumstance because the battery storage component is such a small portion of the hybrid resource. Instead, the hybrid resource should use the solar default energy bid, oftentimes, which is the LMP based option. A second option that the ISO looked at was considering what if the largest component of the hybrid resource was considered the component that sets the hybrid default energy bid as a whole. And this approach, although there's a benefit to having the majority of the resource be, something that is have the default energy bid reflect the majority of a resource, this approach may lead to hybrid components being positioned differently in the bid stack compared to standalone assets of the same technology. So an example of this is if let's say we have a 100 megawatt hybrid resource again with a 60 megawatt of solar and 40 megawatts of storage. Because the solar component is the largest component, under this approach, the solar default energy bid value would be used for the hybrid resource. However, it would make it such that this hybrid storage component would have a lower default energy bid compared to standalone storage resources. And under mitigation, this may mean that hybrid storage components would be discharged prior to standalone storage resources, which even though they may have the same technology and the same otherwise costs. A third approach that we considered was the weighted average approach. And this approach would have the default energy bid for the entire hybrid resource be a weighted average of the component's default energy bids. So the rationale here is that this actually produces the closest estimate of what the hybrid resources costs are. But while doing so, the hybrid resources most expensive component would have a higher cost compared to what the default energy bid for the resource would be. And the hybrid resource with the least expensive component would have lower costs compared to what the overall resource's default energy bid would be. So this is an approach that the ISO also sees as viable, but has some material drawbacks. One is that it breaks that link between what is the cost of using the component and what is the default energy bid that represents those costs. And the second is that, like Sergio was saying with the guiding principles, this approach would produce a bit stack positioning for hybrid components that would be different than the bit stack positioning of standalone assets with the same cost. So, okay, I see a hand from Sergio. Let's take that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something quickly. If you can go to the prior slide.
Yep.
I think a big part of why we were thinking about the largest component and the weighted average approach as introducing some bit stack positioning risk is directly related to the fact that we're thinking about the storage depth as being primarily determined by opportunity costs, right? Like the most important kind of input for the storage depth is the opportunity cost. And then we have the majority of hybrids are storage plus something else. And while they might have different energy costs, the hybrids, because they charge on site, they face very similar opportunity costs. Now, they face very similar opportunity costs in the sense of when and at what value they can sell their stored energy. So because of that, we did end up thinking, well, the weighted average or the largest component approach will always yield a different DEB than if it was just the storage DEB. And it will always tend to position hybrids as having, if not lower, at least different opportunity costs than their standalone homologs. So that's really a part of why we wanted to maybe explore more the greater of approach. But we definitely welcome feedback on that. I know that several folks on the call and in the room have experience with this or any thoughts. So just wanted to add that. Thank you, Dinesh.
Thank you, Sergio. Okay, so now going into a couple of examples that were included in the paper as well. So the assumption here is let's compare the different approaches, the three different approaches, and show what would happen with different configurations of resources under each of the hybrid DEB approaches. So the assumed values for this scenario is that there is a static storage default energy bid of $25 per megawatt hour. Now note here that the goal here is for the hybrid default energy bid methodology to work with whatever approach comes out of that storage default energy bid methodology discussion that Sergio was presenting earlier today. So if it was a time of day based approach, the idea would be that this hybrid DEB approach would also kind of stack on top, right? So the storage default energy bid could change throughout the day, and then it would also be reflected in what the hybrid default energy bid methodology would be. So the second assumed value is $5 for the locational marginal price option. And the assumption here is that the solar component would be otherwise using this LMP option. And then the third assumption here is that the variable cost-based option would be $35 per megawatt hour, and that thermal resources and gas resources would use this methodology in this scenario. So looking at the bottom chart here, looking for a solar and battery hybrid resource, the first two columns show what the makeup of the resource is. So let's take the first row, first column, would say that there's 20 megawatts of storage in this hybrid resource. And then the second column would show that there's 80 megawatts of solar, making up 100 megawatts for this hybrid resource. And the third column here is the current default energy bid, of which there's not an applicable one. And then the next three columns dictate what happens under each approach for the hybrid resources default energy bid. So for the first row, right, the storage resource, it has a 20 megawatt value. The solar component has an 80 megawatt value, right? When it comes to the greater of, that, it looks at which is the higher default energy bid value. And comparing the solar and the storage has a higher default energy bid value, and therefore the resource as a whole would have a $25 megawatt hour default energy bid. And you can see that reflected for all of the rows and all the different configurations here, because again, it's taking the greatest of the applicable default energy bid values for the components. Going to the next column, which is the largest component approach, you can see that this one changes based off of which resource has, or which component is larger. So when the solar component is larger, then the LMP option becomes the default energy bid for the entire resource. When the storage component is larger, then the storage default energy bid is used as the hybrid default energy bid for the entire resource. And then looking at that third column, the weighted average column, it sort of, takes the proportion of the resource and multiplies that by the value of that hybrid default energy, of that component's default energy bid. So for example, in that first row, 20% of the resource is storage and 80% is solar. So 20% of the resource times the storage default energy bid plus 80% of the resource times the LMP option gives us a hybrid resource default energy bid of $9 per megawatt hour. And okay, so let's go to Sergio.
Yeah, if we can go back to the first scenario slide. Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest takeaway here is if we pick anything but the greater of approach for resources that look like this, which, the majority of hybrid resources are something like solar plus storage, we would, particularly with the largest component and the high weighted average, we would end up with a DEV that is lower than just the regular storage DEV. And I think that is really kind of the question for stakeholders to think about and weigh in on, right? Is it reasonable for a hybrid resource that includes a storage component to have a lower DEV, even when the storage DEV today is not looking at its energy or, let's say, like fuel costs? So, yeah, I just wanted to press that to kind of incept that idea for your feedback here and written comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio and Dinesh. We do have a question. I want to make sure here in the room for Carrie. If you like. Okay, never mind. We'll wait till it's over. But I do see Alva. So maybe this one will be something. Would you like to take questions, Dinesh? Just want to kind of, before we dive into the next topic.
You know what? Let's actually finish out the presentation first, and then we'll go back to the questions if that's okay. Just because I'll be relatively quick from here. So the next example in the paper is around batteries plus thermal resources, and this has it's the same setup with the solar plus the battery, with the same kind of math worked its way out, right? I think this example is also, Sergio was kind of seeding that idea for comments about, well, the components might not match up with standalone resources and other in sort of other areas. And I think with the thermals, it's kind of interesting too, because what the weighted average approach would do is that the thermal component would have a lower default energy bid than the variable cost option. And the idea here is that the variable cost option should be a representative of what the thermal resources, the thermal component's marginal cost should be. So, it's with batteries, this weighted average would show that there's that difference between the two, but it also appears in the thermal as well. But overall as a whole, the resource would have its most accurate marginal cost be represented by a weighted average approach. So with this in mind, the ISO in the straw proposal proposes taking the greater of approach with a minimum share for what is an applicable component for the hybrid default energy bit value. And the ISO also seeks feedback on what this percentage should be, whether this is something that should be a higher value or a lower value for what is considered something that is large enough to be material for that hybrid resource to be represented across the entire hybrid resource. And just one final note here: if all the components fail the minimum share requirement, where most of our hybrid resources are two components, but if there's 3 or 4 components or even more going in the future, the proposal here is that the largest component's default energy bid would be leveraged for that hybrid resource. Okay, let's move to questions now. Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you, Dinesh. So I want to go, maybe Carrie, if you'd like to go first, and then followed by Alva, Jake, and Eric. Okay. Okay. So Carrie said, Alva, go first, and a few others, and then let me know when you want to come in. Okay. Go ahead. Go ahead, Alva. Introduce
Okay,
yourself.
thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. This is Alva from PG&E, and this is really just almost a direct response to what Sergio was bringing up with the solar. But the dual of it is, I'm just trying to. I mean, I think this is the right approach personally, but you can imagine a case where you can exert market power essentially with a solar resource during hours when you have no intention of discharging the battery or even charging the battery, right? And so I just wonder about whether, is this really a problem or I mean, in theoretical terms, it seems like it's a problem, but is it really a problem, that essentially a solar resource can, with market power, there's no ability essentially to mitigate it to what probably should be a much lower bid level in hours where it, essentially the solar hours, it's clear that a battery isn't going to be discharging anyway. So just curious what your response on that issue would be.
Thanks, Alva. Yeah, and I think this is something that we're open to comments and feedback on, right? So I think to rephrase back, just to make sure that I'm understanding your comment here correctly, Alva, it's that in a greater of approach, the lower cost component it maybe should be represented as a lower default energy bid than the hybrid default energy bid as a whole, but it would still get that higher default energy bid value, right? Where the resource that is mostly solar and a bit of storage, which has enough such that it meets that minimum component threshold, that the solar could be in a place to bump up and exercise market power because of the fact that it's got a higher default energy bid than it otherwise would have if it was only by itself and had only the LNP option to work with. So this is a great point and something that we see as a trade-off with taking the greater approach. And we're open to questions from you and others and feedback on how you feel about this.
Next, we have Jake.
Jake McDermott from TerraGen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. Appreciate you all putting something out there. I think it helps to have these conversations when we have a couple of ideas out on the table to kind of talk about. So I have a few comments and concerns about the DEBs, but maybe I'll start with some feedback first on what we have here in the revised straw proposal. So among the three options discussed, if those are the only ones on the table, I'd agree that the greater of option is the preferred. On the minimum share, at this point, I'd recommend not having a minimum share, or if there is one, only have it applied on a going forward basis and not to existing operating assets. I think I read in the proposal, right, that the minimum share is to prevent gaming. And I don't know that it's needed because hybrids will have a follow dot instruction. And I think that becomes pretty difficult to do if you undersize your battery system. So I don't think you'd ever see someone putting a small battery onto what would have otherwise been a standalone VER for the purpose of gaming and obtaining a higher DEB than may be warranted. But if that is something that CAISO would want to move forward with, I think you can set it so, again, it only applies to new resources. Or you could look at the universe of existing hybrids and pick the smallest percentage that you see on operating assets so as to not unfairly bias it against existing facilities. So that's my first cut on improvements for what CAISO has currently on paper. And I have more thoughts to share, but maybe open it back up to CAISO to see if you guys have any feedback on what I've shared so far.
Yeah, I guess, I wanted to just maybe tease it out a little bit more, Jake, in terms of what is the concern if, if we find that there are hybrid resources that have very small components, like what is the concern about having that minimum percentage be set at this point in time? I think we've lost.
Jake, if you'd like to respond, please raise your hand. There he is. Let's go ahead.
Awesome,
Jake.
thanks. I was talking to myself there for a moment. I think the concern is that you'd have a DEB then for that facility that is much lower than would otherwise be warranted, right? So if you take I think the example that you provide in the paper is 100 megawatt resource, 99 megawatts of solar, and 1 megawatt of a battery. Let's say that's the example. With that minimum percentage, it would then be subject to the VER-based DEB. And so I think the concern is, especially for existing facilities, that when they were constructed, there was never a DEB applied. And now there's a DEB applied, but it's now the very low LMP-based DEB that's applied to the VERs. So I think that's the concern that I have with the minimum percentage, especially for existing facilities, is that it might drastically understate their actual costs. But again, I understand. I think what I understand about the intention that you all had in the paper was to prevent gaming, and I think that's a laudable thing to want to prevent. But there's probably a way to either tease out the number in a way that doesn't unfairly burden existing facilities.
Got it. So just to repeat back to make sure I'm understanding, the concern here would be that in that example of a 99 megawatt solar resource and a 1 megawatt, 99 megawatt solar component and a 1 megawatt storage component, that the 1 megawatt storage component would be subject to the same default energy bid as the 99 megawatts that the solar component would be, and that
Right.
that 1 kilowatt of storage would be positioned differently than if it was independent.
Well, I think the entire facility would be positioned differently, right? Because it's the one resource ID, and so because you're bidding it as one, you're effectively applying a different default energy bid to it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jake.
Yeah. The other I wanted to keep going a little bit further because I had some other feedback to share, which was I touched on some of this in the RA call earlier today, but I wanted to talk about maybe how we think about the DEB and if it's actually capturing the real operational costs of hybrid assets. And so right now, my recollection is we've been told that we can't use dynamic limits to manage our SOC, right? And that needs to be done through bids. And at the same time, we see standalone storage, and that does have its SOC managed by the market model. So there's this inherent difference in how the market model treats these assets, and then what the expectations are of the market versus an operator. And I think that makes taking the storage DEB and just applying it to hybrids a little incompatible, right? Because for hybrids, you might have grid charging restrictions that as a scheduling coordinator, you need to manage, and that storage DEB fails to include. And so part of my thinking here at this point is that before we apply a DEB to hybrids, we probably need to really figure out what tools CAISO is going to provide operators to manage the SOC that's not through a bidding construct. And I just to really underscore it, there is a level of it's challenging for this group of assets that have unique operational constraints that impact their bids and also subjecting them to a DEB. And I think you can kind of see some of the tension here in the slides when you talk about the component level costs. And those component level costs are important, right? But they're not the full universe of costs and operational constraints that hybrids face. So this, I guess to put it sum it up in a sort of pithy takeaway, it's the sort of the idea of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so the true DEB for the hybrid might actually be larger than the DEB for storage because of these unique operational constraints that we have to deal with.
Okay, so the idea here would be that the hybrid resource should, assuming that it has a storage component, the hybrid resource may, there are scenarios in your mind that mean that the hybrid default energy bid in some cases should actually be higher than either one of its components, is what I'm understanding here.
Okay.
I think we
Great.
lost Jake. Maybe if we can go back to Jake one more time just to confirm that that's the takeaway.
Okay.
Thanks. Yes, that is exactly the takeaway. I think that there are, again, just these unique parts of this resource class that make it challenging. It just looks so different in the scheduling room for our operators relative to our co-located or even standalone assets. And so I think that those are real constraints that we face. And again, you could even think about having the grid charging restrictions. If a hybrid faces those restrictions, how do we factor that in to what a DEB should be, for example? So it's it really needs to be higher than either of the two individual components because again of these unique constraints. And again, not to beat a dead horse here, but it's if we had better tools either through the market or as operators to manage the SOC, that could help us with some of these challenges. But that's the tension is being told to manage the SOC through bids and then receiving a DEB that is far below what our true operational costs are. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Jake. And looking forward to sort of hearing more and seeing some of these scenarios kind of shared in comments if that's something that you're able to do. Okay, moving on to the next question, please.
Yeah, Dennis, we do have a few questions in the room, so I want to make sure those folks have time to respond. Maybe Dawn go first and then Carrie.
Don, California Energy Storage Alliance. So I was just going to follow on with what Jake said. I think his recommendation with regards to the percentage, the approach to determining the right amount, I think you should just look at what the existing hybrid fleet is and see what it would have been, because none of them determined their configuration to determine which DEB they were going to have. So I think that's a great starting point, and then see what that number is and then apply that going forward. Because I think then if someone didn't like that approach, then what they should do is do co-located and not be a hybrid. So they still have ways to manage it going forward on it. And I would note that I also think that one of the reasons why why the new DEB that we've been talking actually makes extension to the hybrids, I think, more appropriate than, because it gets to a little bit of the second point that Jake was making than what the current DEB does. So I think it's the fact that we have a new DEB, new storage DEB that sort of makes this extension more possible.
Great. Thank you, Don.
This is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I'm going to go back to what Alva was saying. That was my initial comment, but I was waiting to see if someone else brought it up. And that's whether, you're considering whether if you use the greater of approach, if it matters, if it's possible that solar will exert market power up to the storage DEB. And I thought a lot about that, Alva. And I was thinking, there just doesn't look like there's any evidence in the market that storage wants to do anything but generate. So I can't imagine why they would systematically try and exert market power. And even if they did, they could only exert it up to the storage DEB, which is really limited in impact. So I don't see that as a reason to not move forward with the greater of approach. Yeah. Well, oh, sorry, did I say storage? Solar, right? Because solar wants to generate. Storage wants to generate too. People like to make money in the energy market. I don't know why we all pretend like these generators are trying not to generate. 99.9% of the time, you make money in the energy market. That's the point. Especially if you have scarcity pricing. Shout out to price formations. The next point I wanted to make goes back to what Jake was saying. And that was going to be a question I had, which is if you can't grid charge, does that change your opportunity cost multipliers, or even how you would consider the opportunity cost? Because you want to at least make sure you have sufficient discharge available through your RAIM hours for multiple reasons now, for presumably UCAP calculations for if RAIM stays the same. And so, you do at times want to bid in a manner that makes sure that your, capacity is preserved to those hours. And my concern a little bit with the greater of approach and just blanket applying the storage default energy bid is that you wouldn't be able to do that easily. I can imagine there's some simpler ways to modify it by just increasing the amount a little bit. But that's something I think we should consider very carefully. Thanks.
Thank you, Carrie. I see a hand from Sergio.
Yeah, I have a quick reaction there. I think that's an interesting point, Carrie, of are the opportunity costs of hybrid resources that have chosen to limit themselves to charge from on-site resources different? I think a big part of going back to what Don just mentioned, I think part of why we think this works is because we're rethinking the storage DEB in a way that captures that changing and greater opportunity cost in the hours leading up to when you want those resources to discharge. So they can signal that economic unwillingness to be discharged ahead of time better. But at the same time, we are kind of, in what we're doing in the storage DEB, we are eliminating the incidence of the energy cost, which is probably the big difference when you charge from the grid or not. So we welcome comments on that. I think that would be an interesting area to hear from you all on, if those opportunity costs are different, how to include that or capture that. I I think that's something that maybe goes in the potential enhancements beyond applying the grade-off approach. But I think what I hear from the room too is there's value in the grade-off approach. There are like additional questions for us to kind of address. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Sergio.
I also think
And-
it matters whether you go forward with the time of day approach or the static approach, because at least from your initial data, it looks like the time of day default approach has a lower default energy bid than the static approach during RAIM hours. It goes down an hour 19. And I don't know if that's every day, but at least in your example day, that would, yeah, it would depend, but I think it'd be really important to test that at least for hybrid resources.
Thank you. And just to be clear for the room, this point was not something that was discussed in this proposal. So right now, whether there's grid restrictions or grid charging restrictions or what have you, that resources choose to put into play, it is not something that impacts how the hybrid default energy methodology would be applied. Thank you. Okay, next question, Brenda, do we have another one in the room that you'd like to go to?
Oh, we do. Go ahead. And we are limited on time, so if you could be really brief. I know there's two folks online.
Sure. This is Rahul with AES. So let me first respond to what Don just mentioned about the total number of hybrid resources in the system. I think that's a really good starting point, and you can go and see how many resources there are. I can anecdotally tell you that there are a handful, and there are very specific reasons for why some chose hybrid versus co-located. Going back to Don's point of the resources could choose to switch between hybrid and co-located, it's not that straightforward. There are different reasons why resources ended up being hybrid. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. The preferred solution for most solar plus storage configuration is actually co-located. So if they're in hybrid, there are different reasons that drove to that solution. We are one of the operators and owners of hybrid resource. So one of the things I am looking for when I do my analysis and file comments is see if this creates some sort of a disadvantage for a hybrid configuration. I would try to look at this from how close this is for a treatment in a co-located configuration. And if we get into just a simple example, if it is 1-to-1, right, like it's the second 40-60 or 60-40, that's the lens I would recommend CAISO to see if it can get fair treatment as if it was co-located. I think that's, thank you.
This is Don. I just wanted to clarify my remarks. I don't think you can go backwards. I wasn't expecting anybody that's a hybrid to change to co-located. I thought on a going forward basis, then you could make the determination. So new projects, I wouldn't go retroactive on this at all.
Great, thank you for those comments.
Oh, thank you, Dinesh. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm not seeing, yeah, thanks for those comments, Rahul and Don. I'm not seeing any other hands. Okay, I'm seeing a hand from Eric Little come back up. So Brenda, could we move to Eric, please?
Yeah, sure, Eric. Go ahead.
Hi, Eric Little from CalCCA. Thank you. So I generally agree with what I heard, particularly from Alva. My only concern, though, is you did talk about the potential that there are going to be resources that are looking to be hybrid that are a combination of gas and battery storage. And I'm not sure there might be some on there now. I do seem to recall that in the early days of this, that situation was to be able to provide ancillary services that they wouldn't otherwise be able to provide because the gas resource couldn't start in time. So we might have some of those already. The difficulty with that then is that you have the wrong default energy bid in place for that type of a situation potentially. And I'm kind of concerned about that. So while I generally agree that you're not going to use a renewable zero marginal cost resource to withhold from the market, I think it's unlikely given the times of day that it's going to generate. I don't see that same situation holding true with gas. So is it possible that the ISO would look at the default energy bid differently for a hybrid that is a combination of controllable resources and a combination of an uncontrollable resource?
That is something that hasn't been thought about in the paper so far. And just to be clear with everyone, I believe that the comments here are in reaction to if the chosen approach was a weighted average approach. So the proposal here is to go with the greater of approach. So if there was a battery and a thermal resource, and the thermal variable cost-based option was higher than the storage DEB, then it would go, then the hybrid DEB for the resource would be that variable cost option rather than the storage one. Or
Right.
some
So
sort
in
of
this,
blend.
so in the illustrative example that you've given here, where the variable cost is 35 and the storage deb is 25, I can economically withhold the storage resource to the tune of $10.
Economically withhold the storage.
Because
Oh,
my default
as
energy
in the
bid is, yeah, my default energy bid to discharge it is 35 bucks when its cost is 25, right? So if
Yeah.
its marginal cost was 25, if the default energy bid is reflective of their marginal cost, I can economically withhold the resource to the tune of $10.
With, you know, under the circumstances that this is under mitigation, right? So that's a more narrow set of circumstances, and also, yes, when taking sort of that narrow window, yes, there's a situation where that storage resource, echoing what Alva was saying, would have that ability to be positioned higher than it otherwise would be.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
Next, we have Max. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, Dinesh. Thanks for presenting this. I worked with Wellhead to present that greater of approach, so I'm glad to see it taking traction. My question or suggestion on hybrids is to perhaps look at the universe of hybrids that are registered today. I don't have a percentage to recommend, but also to keep in mind, I'm aware that there are a number of gas turbines with batteries, as Eric said, sub-hourly that create a circumstance where they can dispatch, through that range of negative as you'd expect with a battery. So to not only consider what the universe of resources are today, but potentially what those gas thermals with batteries would look like. So I don't have a percentage. The other I wanted to go back to real quick, the weighted average discussion though, just to clarify. In hours where solar isn't capable of producing, would that weighted average still apply?
Given that we would be setting one default energy bid for the whole day, I believe the answer would be yes. That it would still apply there. Good question there. And that's something that we can also follow up more on in terms of having more details and further fleshing out what the implications would be in a follow-up round.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Dinesh.
Any more
Go
questions
ahead.
in the room, Brenda?
No, I think we're good here. Yeah,
Great.
thank you.
Great. Passing it back to you then.
All right, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. And Sergio, do you want to go? Yeah. So we do have about maybe 10 minutes for a quick break, and then we'll come back at 2:55 p.m. Pacific time. Ryan, if you can put that in the chat, we'll be right back. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Hey, Ryan, can you relaunch the presentation?
You can take control back whenever.
Thank you. I'm not co-host, so I wasn't able to go. Can you just go to the break slide?
Whenever Sergio gets back, you can let him know he can take control now.
Will do. Thank you. So we'll get started. Just checking. Are we still in the live room? Okay, I see. Okay. All right, everyone, we're gonna get started on the second half of the meeting with Sergio. He'll be going in the discussion of NGR bidding concept. Take
Excellent.
it away.
Thank you very much, Brenda. Hope stretching your legs, grabbing some coffee was successful. So let's go to the third and final part of our meeting today, This relates to the NGR bidding concept that we included in the paper published last week for further discussion and kind of further evaluation with you all. This is directly related to the conversations we had in our last meeting. What I'll try to do in the next slides really is to provide an overview of why we are thinking about a modified bidding paradigm, a reframed bidding paradigm, what inspired us to think about this and share it with you all by explaining some of the limitations of the current framework. And then finally, we have included some questions here for discussion to facilitate some reaction during this call, but also to inform the feedback that you might provide us in your written comments that we really value, and I think it will help the community here and us at the ISO think through this item and how it might inform our efforts moving forward. So yeah, I'll quickly, explain kind of the limitations of today's framework, the concept we included for discussion in the paper, and then go over the key questions to see if that elicits some conversation. So I think the first part, the first element to kind of get alignment on here and make sure we're all coming from the same background is why is storage significantly different than generating assets that we've thought of in the electricity sector for quite a while, particularly conventional thermal resources. So storage is different because compared to conventional assets, storage is state of charge limited. The dispatch decisions of a storage resource depend on the current and future opportunities, and the opportunities in the current and future intervals depend on the prior decisions you've made with your state of charge. So basically, the value of energy is always dependent on your future market conditions. And because of that, when storage resources bid today, they're not only communicating or conveying their cost to inject that megawatt hour, but they're also conveying their preferences, their opportunity costs with those bids. So since storage has these unique characteristics, the question that, it comes to us that are thinking about market design is how can markets most efficiently incorporate that expectation of value, that opportunity cost into dispatch? So how do we do that today? Today, storage resources submit a monotonically non-decreasing bid curve. You can think about it as a set of stairs that always goes up. It's a bid curve that is always going up, and it gives us these pairings of megawatts and dollars per megawatt hour. We then take that bid curve and we consider the bid curve, we consider the state of charge constraints of the asset, we consider the efficiency of the asset, and we use all that in the optimization, and we view the bid curve as the economic willingness to charge or discharge by the assets at different different prices. Now, that is not the end of how the market works, though, because when the market within the optimization horizon recognizes that the storage resource state of charge constraints might bind, meaning that within the optimization horizon, the storage might be full or run out of state of charge. When the market recognizes that, it also includes consideration of the bid spread into its decisions. And the bid spread, as we explain in the paper, is that difference between the highest charging offer and the lowest discharge offer. So basically, the market looks at that bid spread, looks at that difference that it takes from the bid curve submitted by the asset and interprets that difference as the minimum arbitrage value, basically as this is the minimum spread that the market needs between charging and discharging for the resource to be in the money. So now the optimization is looking at the bid curve, but it's not taking those dollar per megawatt hour and megawatt pairings as the sole driver of dispatch. It's also taking into account that spread and whether that spread is respected or even maximized looking forward, in the advisory intervals. Now, this creates some challenges. The current framework creates some challenges. In the paper, we try to expand and kind of detail those challenges. Here, I'm trying really to summarize them pretty quickly. So the first challenge is that there is a forecasting burden on scheduling coordinators of storage resources. They basically need to think about what is the state of charge that their asset will be at during the relevant trade hour. And in real time, they need to think about that 75 minutes ahead of time. So they need to look into the future and think about what this state of charge will be at that point. The second thing they need to forecast is they need to think about what prices will look like during that optimization horizon, during that hour, because that way they need to submit bids that get them the state of charge outcomes that they want. If they believe that prices will rise through that hour, but they want to preserve state of charge, they may submit fairly high discharge bids to represent, I don't want to be discharged right now. But that's a balancing act that they need to work on, particularly for that in real time during the optimization horizon, because they must construct these hourly bids ahead of time, predicting state of charge needs, predicting prices, so that then they can get the state of charge outcomes they want. So that's the first issue. The second issue is that all storage is doing that at the same time. Every storage resource is trying to get ahead of price formation at the same time. So now there's an endogeneity challenge, right? Of every storage resource forecast will now be affected by the action of every other storage resource. The third challenge is that in the current bidding paradigm, we assume that the bid spread, that is the difference between the charging and discharging ranges, represents or reflects the efficiency, cycling, and variable operations costs. But we have identified that sometimes resources do not submit bid curves that respect that. Basically, sometimes resources may submit a bid curve where the spread between charging and discharging is very small. And it might seem then that, that bid curve is not respecting what would be their cycling or degradation costs. And the final challenge is that whenever storage is bidding in real time, they are, again, trying to manage their state of charge, this time in reference to their awards and schedules from day ahead. But the real-time bidding framework and its outcomes are largely independent, right? Meaning storage needs to continuously be thinking about how they're bidding in real time to get an outcome consistent with day ahead, but their bids are never in relation to their position in day ahead. So this, again, complicates that forecasting issue that we talked about in the first slide, that forecasting burden, that the asset always needs to think ahead of price formation to get the state of charge management it desires. And in the context of real time and day ahead, this can contribute meaningfully to differences between the real time outcomes and the day ahead results or day ahead schedules. So we actually had identified a lot of these challenges in years prior. And because of that, the ISO developed what we call the end of hour state of charge parameter. To address some of these challenges, we implemented this optional parameter in real time. And this allows our resource to specify a target state of charge range and tell the ISO, I want to reach this range of state of charge by the end of this real-time trade hour. And the market will shepherd the resource to that outcome. No, it will attempt to achieve that specified state of charge, and in doing so, it might dispatch the assets even uneconomically. When we developed this parameter, we immediately saw some advantages. No, it conveys the state of charge preferences. It reduces the need for indirect bidding strategies. But we were also made aware by the MSC stakeholders of some limitations of the end of hour state of charge parameter. The bid cost recovery consequences made it so that some assets did not want to leverage it. And also because it sets a range that will be respected even uneconomically, there's limited ability of the market to continue to economically leverage that resource when a range has been specified. So right after we discuss the idea of the end hour state of charge, and during that process, the MSC offered some feedback of, maybe this end of hour state of charge optional parameter could be complemented by including an economic value for stored energy. Maybe with that economic value for the stored energy, the market would be able to understand and see that as the penalty price to meet that end of hour state of charge range, rather than meeting it even uneconomically under the proposal that was ultimately implemented. Now, in parallel, I would say a couple years later, we've also identified that there's work ongoing on taking this principle of bidding around the differences of state of charge relative to a reference state of charge further than what the MSC envisioned in their idea to expand or enhance the end of hour state of charge parameter. In ongoing work from a current MSC member, Ross Baldick, we've seen this notion of a formulation of modifying the bidding so that rather than submitting all of this charge and discharge bids for every single hour, storage resources would instead submit a willingness to pay or willingness to be paid for ending a optimization horizon with more or less energy relative to a reference state of charge. So basically now the market is answering a different question. No, the market is no longer answering how should storage charge and discharge given this price. The market is now answering what is the value of the energy remaining at the end of this horizon. So the core concept really that we've tried to explain and put forth in the paper, the core concept is we could replace today's 10-segment bid curve with a different bidding paradigm based on a terminal value bid. And that bid would represent the asset's willingness to pay for a higher end of horizon state of charge or be paid for a lower end of horizon state of charge. In other words, rather than assets submitting a bid curve that they believe the specific pairings will achieve the SOC result they want, the assets are conveying, I want to end this interval, this hour at a higher state of charge if you pay me this much per megawatt hour, or if I pay this much per megawatt hour, sorry, or the other way around. I'm willing to end this hour at a lower state of charge if I get paid this much per megawatt hour. Some of the elegance of this reframing really comes from the fact that now the bid is fully based on that future expectation of opportunity costs, which, as you recall from the DEB conversation, that's really what we hold as what should be the driver of the storage bid. No, the driver of the storage bid should be their expectation of the value of that stored energy beyond in future intervals. And this way, the market, as it can do today, it will determine that optimal charging and discharging. The key difference really is that in today's framework, the optimization is taking the bid spread and propagating that as like revenue condition, let's say, for the future intervals. Basically, you need to respect at least this for your decisions in the future intervals. Under this modified framework, under this reframed framework, the optimization instead is taking the terminal value and it's really asking, how valuable is this energy at the end of the horizon? So now the optimization is able to dispatch the resource based on that future energy value coming from the bid. And we are able to create a linkage between the implied or reference state of charge. This is a bit more clear when we look at it by market. So this notion, this idea would make it so that in the day-ahead market, the storage resources would be able to submit a bid or offer, right, that represents their willingness to pay or be paid for deviating the end of the day state of charge relative to their initial state of charge. This is pretty critical, especially now that we're seeing more days where the earlier hours might be more valuable than the later hours in the day. Because this will allow the storage resource to say, well, I know that tomorrow in the day ahead market, tomorrow prices might be, as expected, but the day after prices are likely to be even higher. So I want to tell the market, hey, I would like to end the day ahead market with a higher state of charge relative to my initial state of charge, because I think that the day after my stored energy will be even more valuable. So it creates that linkage. Then in real time, we are creating that linkage again, but instead of looking at the initial state of charge, we're looking at the state of charge trajectory resultant from day ahead. So basically now your bids in real time are around, do I want to deviate from my state of charge trajectory resultant from day ahead? And this is pretty critical for the conversations we've also had before around bid cost recovery, for example, because it does create that connection, that linkage between what was the outcome of your day ahead results, right? The position resultant from that, and how you can bid or be price responsive beyond that in real time. With this, we are allowing that connection without eliminating the ability of the resource to be economically leveraged in real time to address, unforeseen or new circumstances. So I'll go to, I see there's a question in the room. I'll go right there, right after this slide. I think what we got from feedback following our meeting in May was, this sounds interesting, but there's a lot to be discussed. I think that's really the gist of the feedback we got from stakeholders. There could be some value here and there, but there's definitely the need for detailed discussions before we kind of move quickly into fundamental changes. So the remainder of the slides I've prepared for this afternoon really are all about those discussion questions that we think might surface, the items that we need to further develop, that we want to address moving forward, and also to further expand if people believe there's value in some of the elements here, or maybe others not so much. So I'll pause there. Let's start with the room and then go to the phone line. Yeah.
Raul, you can go first.
Hi, this is Rahul with AES. So you have a few questions. Let me start with, I'm trying to recall, there was a discussion about an ESR model that was done maybe 2 years or 3 years ago. The ESR model fundamental was how to better manage the SOC. So it was a relationship of SOC and bids rather than dispatch and bid, megawatts and bid. Is this concept high level revisiting the same, or this is different from, this is just conceptual idea for now? I'll let you respond and then I'll go on my follow-up questions.
Yeah, I would say this is different than the ESR model, right? The ESR model is basically trying to solve, let me put it this way, and this is a little bit an off-the-cuff response, but I think you'll get where I'm coming from. The ESR model solves a subset of the challenges that this model tries to solve. The ESR model, perhaps its biggest driver, is that it's trying to recognize that the value of the stored energy varies as the state of charge varies. Basically, the value of your stored energy is a function of state of charge. In this paradigm, you can also recognize that. You can also represent that. You can also address that challenge. But it goes a bit of a step further, because now the management of the state of charge is not done so like purely by your bids, which would still be the case in the ESR model as we do today. Now the management is also of the state of charge reflected by conveying to us your willingness to deviate from your reference SOC. I think that's how I would imagine it. So ESR is a little bit of a subset, let's say, of what this is trying to do.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation. I'll give you some off-the-cuff remarks and how we've been thinking about some of these things. Most model discussion are purely academic in the sense how you think things would work. And then when you go in markets, there is a reality of how things actually land. Where we are today in the markets is after years of experience of working with the current NGR framework. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of challenges with the NGR, but sometimes you are okay with an existing framework, then going to a completely new framework because you don't know what you don't know. And that is very difficult to convey in written comments. And I'll give you off the cuff or just anecdotal response is sometimes even today's framework doesn't align with megawatt quantity or price. You do get the shift of, what I was trying to do in my offers versus what the market actually did. And that's an artifact of how things work. The two things that you highlighted, which we've observed, but did not know if it's very well seen across ISO is you no longer have the solar hours as the cheapest and net peak as the highest price. The highest price of the day is moving around such that you could have midnight hours as your highest price hours. So, and the other observation is maybe I have a better opportunity to sell in the next day rather than the current day. And those are very attractive things to think, but I would also like to hear a much bigger view of, are we chasing solutions which are created, trying to solve the problem because the market is bidding in one way? And it goes back to your original point that if historically the expectation was your thermal assets are the marginal resource in net peak, and that's what drives the price. But if storage is the marginal outside of solar hours, how would you think of solving that problem? So I like the concept what you have, but a lot of reservation of moving away from what folks are comfortable. But we'll try to put in our comments, we'll try to put more scientific response.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rahul. And just a very quick reaction. I think it's very interesting because part of what you mentioned was effectively, I think it's kind of the other side of the coin of some of the challenges we see, because you mentioned today we have a lot of experience with NGR already and we've been getting better. But even today, there are outcomes that you perhaps didn't get the state of charge management outcome you envisioned, precisely because of the challenge of having to submit this bid 75 minutes ahead of time and you need to engage in all of this forecasting, but you knew the directional state of charge outcome you wanted. Right? You knew that it was your preference to maybe end that hour the state of charge you started, or a little bit higher or a little bit lower. So you knew what you wanted, but the outcome didn't work between the bids, the timing, the constraints. So I think like this seeks to be a neater way of you conveying the outcome you want. So that's a part of it. And then the other part that I wanted to kind of react to is I definitely understand the reservation of the unknown, that we want to be cautious about it. And that's precisely why we want to kind of surface a lot of these questions to try to address them, because I don't believe that this is something kind of uniquely attractive for the ISO. I do think it solves some challenges that I hear from market participants. So I'll try to, just as you'll try to reflect that in your comments, we'll try to reflect that better too. Thank you. Don?
Don Trethewey, California Energy Storage Alliance. So I'm similar to Rahul. I think that, one of the reasons CISA brought up the September or the 2020 comments from the MSC is because it did a very good job of explaining the importance of accurately reflecting the opportunity costs in the market. And so I think that's why I think we've seen the improvement in the proposal regarding the default energy bids. And so I would not want us to lose any momentum on addressing the default energy bids to focus on this. That being said, I do think that, and I think you correctly identified what's actually different about this is that it's the reference to the day ahead schedules and the optimal SOC that came out of that day ahead schedule that that's what's new. And it's basically trying to say, we know since we can optimize over a 24-hour horizon that when you get into the real time where you can't do that, the best estimate of what it should be absent, material change in system conditions is the system-wide SOC that you saw as a result of the day ahead results. And so I think that to me is what is advantageous of taking this approach, but it's also why we've advocated for, let's just publish the system-wide state of charge. What is it right now relative to what it was day ahead? And then that would better inform people's non-generated resource bids today. And then the only other comment I would have on this, and this is another comment that CISA's made for a while now, is it's not just this end of horizon constraint that we need to think about. There are other constraints that will modify the dispatch, impact the prices, and we need to understand how those work better before we layer on or make a significant change like this. And unfortunately, if we look at the way that, like the configurable parameters and some of the assumptions there, I don't think we fully appreciate either the price suppression nature of those, and are we, or even worse, are we not getting what we actually thought we bought because it's not deliverable, it's not available in real time. And so I think we need to think about those and have a better understanding how those work, and then layer on. But again, it's a good discussion because to have, it's just when.
Thank you, Don. Yeah. Thank you for the comment too on not losing steam on other topics on this. I appreciate that. I think Alba?
Go ahead, Alva. Yeah, you'll be unmuted. Introduce yourself.
Great, thanks. This is Alva from PG&E again. Sergio, thank you so much for presenting this. I see this no contradiction of what Don was saying. I think this is really this is an extended process to get to a model like this. It has a lot of potential for a future in which batteries aren't all 4-hour batteries, and it offers a lot of potential. But I do think I'll give you several arguments for why it is actually going to be an extended process to get there, and probably multi-year. One is that CAISO is essentially taking on the risk of operating the battery during the course of the day, and that would include ancillary service types of risk. And so it's going to have to decide how much of that it wants to absorb, whether it's going to, essentially, if it's going to not require the battery to be at any particular state of charge in its bids during the day, then it has to take the risk of getting them where it wants them for ancillary services or even for flexibility. So I think that's a major one. A second major one is the issue of how the CAISO is going to deal with how essentially the battery says, I'm willing to pay for some increased state of charge, or I'm willing to sell you some state of charge. And the day ahead market leaves the battery at a given state of charge, right? Now, when you are running the next day's day ahead market, do you take that as a binding initial state of charge? Well, you can't really, can you? Because there's real-time stuff that happens between now and then. So does the CAISO now have to really carefully forecast what that state of charge is going to be? And does it have to take some risk in getting the battery to its initial state of charge in order for this bid to be meaningful? So I think, I'm not saying this can't be done, but it is a pretty significant effort. Again, the CAISO might have some risk there that then it has to pass on to loads, of course, because that's how the CAISO market works. So I think those are two. There was at least one other I was thinking about, which I can't remember right now, but I think this model has a lot of promise. Oh yeah, I'll tell you the other one is even more basic, which is suppose you have a system like Don and Rahul were saying, where batteries are the majority of the system, and all of these batteries essentially get their end state awards. Presumably, they're going to pay exactly what they said they were going to pay for their state of charge. But how does that? First of all, is that the case? Do they? And then how do you propagate that into the price formation in the day ahead market? Even in real time, it's probably an issue. You have to set prices based on the shadow prices of these constraints, and it's going to be potentially more esoteric than the way that prices are set today, which at least has some relation to bids, and to sort of taking a slight, perturbation around bids, basically. So I think those are all questions that probably can be answered, and there's lots of work for academics probably in doing it, but I don't think you're going to get there in a year, probably even 2 years, because these are really basic questions about the market. So I'm an enthusiast for this, but I just don't think you're going to get there quickly.
Yes, thank you for that, Alba. And I think you got to several of the questions I wanted to kind of also pose here for reaction. And I think what I've gathered from the written feedback following the May meeting and some of the conversation here is this has presents some value, but if we want to explore it, let's take our time so we explore it properly. I think that's something for us to take back and consider too. So I guess in the last kind of 30 minutes we have here, what I'll do is I think I have like 4 slides left. I'll stop at each one of them, and I've included some questions here kind of for reaction. Feel free to chime in, raise your hand, raise your placard, but hopefully if hopefully this inspires some conversation, but if it doesn't, at least hopefully it informs a little bit of your thinking ahead of a written comment for all the folks on the call. Yeah. So really the first set of discussion questions are kind of around the value of this concept as a means to better reflect the economics of storage resources. I think in that back and forth we just had with Raul, we were mentioning how, you know, the current bidding framework is a little bit like you're putting your best foot ahead of you to try and get the outcome you already know you want. But here you're more so telling us through your bid or offer the directional outcome you prefer. So I guess some of the questions that we wanted to get a better sense from the stakeholder community are, do you see this bidding framework as a better or more intuitive way to express the economics of storage resources? Do you believe that your colleagues, the scheduling coordinators you work with, will they be able to estimate this directional and terminal value in an easier way than hourly bids as they have to determine today? Is this basically a simpler or more intuitive way of thinking about the outcome that you want and how to represent it in a bid or offer than what we have today? I'll leave that on the table now and go to the second slide quickly to see if folks want to weigh in on either of these. The second one is very much related, and it's around the forecasting burden, which is pretty material when we are thinking around producing hour by hour bid curves. Do you think that a framework like this, where you basically tell us the directional outcome you want and your willingness to pay or be paid, do you think that framework reduces the need for near-term forecasting of prices? And do you think this would maybe allow for an easier way of managing state of charge, particularly in real time? We'd very much like to hear about those, because I think in my experience, when I talk to scheduling coordinators that are within the CAISO balancing authority area, you know, a lot of them are bidding, you know, that's how they primarily manage their state of charge. When I've spoken to people, for example, in the EIM community, a lot of them do leverage the end of hour state of charge biddable parameter as a way to manage their state of charge. So it would be very valuable from kind of folks from both walks to let us know if, when you read this, when you think about this, does it sound as an improvement as to how you would manage your state of charge relative to what do you do today? So maybe I'll pause there to see if there's any reactions on these 2 slides. And if not, I can go to the others, but it'll be good to give folks a chance to see if there's any reactions or thoughts there.
So if there's any questions, please use the raise hand icon. And I don't think there's anyone in the room that has a question. I'll give a few seconds.
Okay, I'm not seeing any, so maybe I'll go to the other 2 and see if those are more exciting. Okay, so the next ones are around bidding flexibility and price formation. Um, so I think some of the comments or kind of reactions we got in our prior meeting were around, why do we just need one bid or offer? Couldn't we have several bids or offers, at least a couple, so that way we can say, if my state of charge is, in the extremes, this is my bid or offer. But if I'm kind of around 20 to 80%, this is my bid or offer. So that's really what we're trying to get to with the first question, like with additional bid and maybe parameters. Maybe this should read more like, with additional bid slash offer segments be necessary to preserve some flexibility. Similarly, I think trying to get a little bit to what Alva and Rahul said as well. Do you believe that a framework like this would improve price signals or maybe make price formation less transparent? To kind of incite some reaction here, when I think about it, going to what Alba had raised, for example, today a storage resource could discharge at a value that is different from the value defined in its bids in real time, given like an MIO outcome, right? So that would also, let's say, adds a layer of, to take Alva's comments, it makes it a bit more esoteric than one would imagine. And I think a similar situation could occur under this revised bidding framework or reformed bidding framework, because once more, we could see a discharge or charge materializing because of that propagation of the end value. So thinking both the status quo and a different bidding paradigm like described here, we would have outcomes that may seem more difficult to disentangle. But I think the advantage or the edge of this framework is that it would make it so that the directional state of charge management outcome that the bidder wanted is always, directly conveyed. I want to end with higher or lower state of charge to the tune of this value or considering this end value. So those are some questions I think that we'd like to hear from you on. Do you think more bid segments are necessary? Do you think this is better, worse, similar, or equivalent in terms of price signals and price formation? I think the final, really two questions that I think it would be valuable for us to think through is around that reference state of charge. I think in our last meeting, Don raised this point of, perhaps in real time, we shouldn't have the day ahead output or state of charge trajectory be the reference, because there might be differences that occur in real time that end up kind of accumulating or stacking over time. So that's really the point of the first question we've included here of, is that day ahead resultant trajectory the appropriate reference point? I also think that gets to Alva's comment around, well, then we would be treating that initial state of charge kind of as a
Hi, it seems like we've lost audio with the boardroom.
I can hear you now. Can we do a test again?
Oh, I think we can hear me, but it's unclear if we can hear the people in the room.
I can hear you. Dinesh, can you?
Yes, can you hear the people in the Kaiso Boardroom Tesla right now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
For those in the boardroom, your audio cut out. I don't know if you can hear us still. Apologies to everyone. Please stand by while they reconnect their audio.
Looks like there's a Kaiso hand in the attendees list. If we could promote that hand to panelists and then unmute them, that would be great.
Okay, can you hear us now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Testing, Ryan, can you reply or say
Yes,
something?
I can hear you.
Okay, 1 second. Somehow we can talk, but the audio's not coming in the room. Weird. Okay, 1 second. At least as long as you guys can hear us, that's good. I'll fix on the audio from your guys' end. Testing.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, testing this one.
Yep, I
Test.
can hear you.
Okay, now we can hear you. All right, thanks.
Okay, can people hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ryan, can you respond? Can you hear us just so we can hear the?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'm just going to repeat what I said in the last two slides for the purposes of the recording and the folks on the call too. So these last two slides, they're really about questions around bidding flexibility and price formation. We'd like to hear from folks if they believe that there are significant material differences on whether this would improve price signals or if price formation could become more or less transparent. I think part of the argument and comment we heard from Alba was that today we might have some difficult to interpret or esoteric outcomes from the current bidding paradigm. I believe that, that's something that could occur on a reformed paradigm too, given the fact that today, we see the propagation of the bid spread and MIO that can influence dispatch and the results of it. Similarly, on the reformed or reframed bidding approach, we would see something like that from the terminal value. So it would be valuable to hear on your written comments or in the discussion here, if folks have any thoughts on that. And then the final set of questions, they're really around, in a reframed paradigm like this one, what would be the adequate or the correct reference state of charge? I think in the last call, Don had mentioned that perhaps it wouldn't be the best idea for the day ahead state of charge trajectory to be the reference state of charge in real time. And that, that's really due to the fact that there may be deviations in real time that kind of build over time or accumulate. So we'd like to see if folks have some feedback on that. And then the last question is really aimed or targeted to get some feedback from the WEIM community around how you believe a bidding paradigm like this would operate for resources that do not have a day ahead schedule. In the paper, we mentioned that we think this could work with base schedules. Today, resources may submit their base schedules. That's kind of their plan. And here, the logic or the benefit would be that if the base schedule becomes the reference, then we can still kind of leverage the resource to deviate economically within their bids if they're interested in doing so. And if they would prefer to just stick to that base schedule, they could continue to leverage the end of hour state of charge biddable parameter that exists today that is respected even uneconomically. So it would be really valuable to hear from the EIM community if there's any feedback on those. That's really what I said when we lost audio. I believe I didn't miss anything, but I'll pause there. I see Alba has raised his hand, and yeah, if others in the call want to react to any of these discussion questions, please raise your hand. Others in the room as well. Thank you.
Okay, so Alva, then we got Raul. That's great. Go ahead, Alva. Quick audio.
Oh,
check.
great. Yeah,
we
can you
can
hear me? Good. And I just raised my hand because I was afraid you were going to have silence. I'm glad Raul is asking. But the one thing I do want to actually ask you directly about is, how does the ISO consider the possibility of ancillary services, especially like regulation, in this framework? I haven't been able to disentangle it myself, and I'm just wondering because if you let people bid to supply ancillary services, it's just essentially they're second guessing where they're going to be and whether they can provide them, and again they're chasing prices. So I think it becomes another iteration of the same thing unless CAISO somehow takes it over. But then there's a question of what are you going to do in that case? So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alba. I mean, I think that's definitely a question that we haven't, in the paper or here, we're not trying to provide a clear or offer an answer at this point immediately. I think we want to also get a sense of, the value of further exploring and discussing this concept, because as you mentioned, we do see the potential for it being a detailed and longer discussion. So at this point,
You want to get the basic buy-in before you start deciding whether the CAISO should take any risk in this on these bets, essentially. So
yeah, buy-in is always important.
Yeah. Thanks.
Rahul, go ahead.
Hi, this is Rahul with AES. Just thinking through of, what are the implications of what we are discussing here, and take a step back and think of, how storage is deployed in the market. And if you look back, maybe last 4 years, 5 years, there has been a significant investment that's been made in the storage platform. And that investment was done with a specific view of what is the return on investment on building storage. And everyone took a view of, what revenue you might expect from the markets versus capacity and so on. And whatever view we take on how to solve this issue is not only the implication of state of charge, how it gets managed on a day-to-day, but it also has a significant impact on how people think of investing in the next set of batteries that come online. So as we think of, how we change this platform of managing SOC, it has a dual impact. And there may be a subset of market participants that only care of shifting energy. It doesn't matter at what price it happens because that's baked in their contract. And there may be other group of people who have a view of what pricing really looks like. Like, what is my energy ARB value for energy ARB? If we go down this path and completely change the paradigm, then everyone has to really think through of how to think of investment going forward. And I think I want to make sure that stays on top of mind when thinking about these solutions, because this serves the dual purpose of it. Not only is the main purpose is not just, how do you manage your state of charge, but also give a signal in the long run, what revenues you could expect. And that can drive pricing, across.
Thank you for that, Raul. Thinking of the market implications are something we'll keep top of mind. I had noticed a hand on the phone, but then it disappeared. It's okay if the question is gone, but if it was an accident, we'll hold some time here.
I think their question might have been answered.
Okay.
Yeah, it was answered.
Okay, well, I am not seeing other hands at this time, and we're coming up on time. So I'll just want to go quickly over this slide, and then I'll pass it on to you, Brenda.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the paper is out. The materials for this meeting are posted. The comment template is as well. We will look forward to your comments on those materials and the meeting today on the 5th. The goal is to take that back and produce a revised straw proposal on these matters, not losing the momentum we've gained around DEB in particular, and building up on our uplift thinking too with how we move forward there. And after we produce that, we'll be looking forward to another hybrid meeting. I think it's been very valuable to have these as hybrid meetings. So that's what's on the horizon. If you have any questions or thoughts, do reach out to us. We'll be happy to chat with you. And with that, I'll pass it on to Brenda to close it out.
Go Don.
Yeah.
Sergio, this is Don from CISA. Can I just make one request?
Yeah.
I really think it would be great to get a review of how BCR has changed now that we've seen the implementation of the settlement rules. Because we went about a year after we implemented, or we approved that policy, but went about a year without implementing it. So people didn't observe and potentially change their behavior as a result of those new rules. And I think it would be beneficial to see what we really are looking at in terms of bid cost recovery for storage, and also to look at it not just as a total number, but as like a dollar per megawatt number, and see how we're trending on that. Because I haven't seen any data to either prove or disprove. Potentially, we may have solved 90% of the problem, and it would just be good to know that.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Don. That's something we're looking forward to include too in this material. So we'll keep that top of mind. Okay, I'm not seeing other hands, so I'll pass it on to you, Brenda. And thank you all for the time today. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Sergio. So just a reminder, we do have that comment template posted on the website as well as the presentation. Feel free to reach out for any questions, but we do want to stick to that deadline as well. And then next slide. We do have our energy blog matters. We just launched an episode for the future of prices. So this is with Jacob Mays and Eric Ila, their guest on this one. So feel free to look into that. And then the other one, the new SunGeo transmission line, a lot of information on that. That's really kind of a great push from the operations team. Definitely a lot of movement and more great things that to come from that project. And then we do have a few meetings coming up. Market Performance and Planning Forum is coming next week. And then we'll do a few other on-site meetings, as we said. But those will be on the calendar, posted with the labels in person and also virtual if needed. And then the next one is the Stakeholder Symposium. We do have that underway. Welcome reception October 5th at the Kempton Sawyer Hotel, followed by the October 6th symposium program at the Safe Credit Union. We're looking forward to all the attendees as well. Thank you to our sponsors. We definitely have a few sponsors that were on this phone call, so thank you so much. We will be posting a lot of information. If needed, feel free to send an email for symposiumreg@kaiser.com if you have any registration questions as we move forward for events. But yes, there's a lot going on, and we will keep everyone in the loop with a lot of meetings that will be in person as well, off-site or in person at the office. But please see those notices and subscribe today. And with that, I think we can close our meeting just in time. And thanks so much for those who came on site. We'll see you at the next meeting. Take care. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you for our speakers. Thank you for all the attendees that are joined in. That concludes our conference. You may now disconnect.